This monument cost $20,000 and was dedicated on July 3rd, 1963, on the 100th anniversary of Pickett's charge. Perry's brigade played a minor role during that charge, and it was the 6th Confederate State Monument placed here at Gettysburg. The next two Confederate monuments you'll encounter are very close to each other. Louisiana State Monument and the Georgia State Monument. Let's take a look at Louisiana first. The Louisiana State Monument would be the 9th monument dedicated here at Gettysburg for the Confederacy. And one interesting thing I've noticed about Mr. Duluth's sculptures, as you will see this at the Mississippi Monument, is that he created them with soldiers having very large feet. The 6th Confederate State Monument you'll encounter belongs to the state of Mississippi. It was dedicated on October 19th, 1973, at a cost of $100,000, thus making this the 10th Confederate State Monument placed here at Gettysburg. Like the Louisiana State Monument, its sculptor was Mr. Donald Duluth. And for those who have noticed, the Mississippi State Monument is also in the background of the ending clip for every episode of Civil War Reports. After visiting the Mississippi State Monument, you'll come to a stop in the road. If you wish to continue to see the rest of the Confederate State Monuments, you'll need to continue to go straight down West Confederate Avenue. If you were to turn right and go down Pumping Station Road, that would take you down to Sachs-Covered Bridge, which we will discuss in a future episode. After crossing over the intersection of Pumping Station Road, the first Confederate monument you'll come to belongs to the state of Georgia. The Georgia State Monument was dedicated on September 1st, 1961, thus making it the 4th Confederate State Monument placed here at Gettysburg. It's located in the area where General Longstreet's Corps would have formed up on July 2nd, 1863, before beginning its attack on the Union lines. General Longstreet's Corps consisted of 4.
Get this in the house.
In your second best. In your second best.
Yeah. Good evening. Oh, let's see. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Stoller. I'm president of the Scottsdale Civil War Roundtable. Welcome to our March meeting. How many of you are either new members or first-time guests here? If you are, just raise your hand. So, well, we have a few. Great. Welcome. Hope you return. Couple things before we get started with our speaker. In April, we're going to announce our 2025-26 speaker program, but I'm going to give you a sneak preview of one of our programs because it's a bit unusual. So 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the United States. And who was president during the 100th anniversary? Grant. U.S. Grant. That's right. So we thought it was appropriate next February to have U.S. Grant visit the roundtable in the form of Kurt Field, someone our speaker here knows quite well.
We were just talking yesterday.
And as many of you have seen Kurt know, and some of you may have seen him on Zoom on a roundtable in 2021, Kurt is U.S. Grant. He's not playing Grant. The guy is channeling Grant. He'll be here on a Tuesday as General Grant, and we've been working with one of our partners, the Museum of the West. And on that Thursday, Kurt's going to appear there as President Grant, speaking on Indian policy. So you have a couple of opportunities to see old Ulysses. And the rest of our program will be announced next month. Next Thursday, March 28th, will be the next meeting of our history discussion group. The topic is going to be the Civil War monuments movement in the 19th century. That's held from 6 to 7:30 at the Wildflower Cafe at the intersection of Scottsdale and Indian Road. It's a time when we have a member-led discussion. It's very informal, a lot of fun. So we hope some of you will take the opportunity to join us. Last month, our topic was the Battle of Antietam, and we had the largest turnout we've had in more than 5 years. So we were very encouraged by that. On Saturday and Sunday, this weekend coming up, the Arizona Civil War Council will be doing a 2-day encampment at Picacho Peak. I'll be heading down there on Saturday for that. It's an opportunity to visit and learn from Union and Confederate reenactors. Speaking of which, one of those reenactors is also a roundtable member, John Fritz. John, are you in here? Okay, back there. John's recently published an incredibly well-researched book on his ancestor, Christopher Fritz of the 105th Illinois Infantry. It's this book, which I've read, and it's really good. Christopher saw a lot of action in the Atlanta and Carolina campaigns, and the book includes excerpts from the diary he kept. As I said, it's a really good read. John is donating a copy to someone attending tonight if they can answer this question: name a battle in Sherman's army fought in the Atlanta campaign, and it can't be Kennesaw Mountain. It's got to be something different. Anybody have any? I heard Resaca. That's right. Who was that? We have a winner. If we can, Al, if you want to pass that up. That's Bill. Was that you? Okay. We're also, as many of you know, we're always looking for opportunities for partnership and collaboration. And our most recent is with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at ASU, which offers more than 100 courses, 15 locations across the valley, aimed at basically the same demographic as our membership. I've met with Ali's director, Jared Zworzynski, and they've promoted tonight's meeting through their own social media newsletter. And so you'll also be seeing things about Ali in our newsletter going forward. Finally, before John Taylor introduces tonight's speaker, I had one further announcement. For the past 14 years, John Van Burl has been on the board of the Roundtable. For 8 of those as the president, and as the president emeritus for the past 4. He's informed us that he will be stepping down from the board when his current term expires at the end of May. It was under John's leadership that this roundtable more than tripled in size, becoming one of the largest and most respected roundtables in the United States. Those of us who've known John over the years know it is his dedication, his passion, his energy, and his relentlessness that have made the Scottsdale Roundtable what it is today. And he has shared that dedication across the country with his work as vice president of the Civil War Roundtable Congress and advising struggling roundtables everywhere. When I became president, I had the benefit of coming into this role with a healthy roundtable and a great board, and that's due to John. He's been my friend, my mentor, and someone I have relied upon and will continue to rely upon for advice. Now, he's not going away. He's going to remain active with the roundtable and the board. You may still be seeing him at the greeters table and active with us elsewhere on a lot of the other things that we're doing. But I would like John to please stand up, and if you will join me in a round of applause. Job well done. And now we turn over to John Taylor.
Good evening, everybody. Yeah, the rumor is John's stepping down from the board because he said the boardroom wasn't big enough for the both of us. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway.
It's not big enough for you.
Fat joke on Wednesday evening. Good evening, everybody. We're really excited tonight to be hosting the great Chris Mackowski. If you don't already know of Chris, that's a shame. That means you're not podcasting as much as you should. So among many things that we could say about Chris, Chris is the founder and the editor-in-chief and the podcaster-in-chief on the Emerging Civil War website, publishing house, and most importantly is the podcast. There's an enormous amount of content, both on YouTube, but also, if you're out in the garden and you want to download a podcast, he's got an endless body of content and works with a lot of historians around the country. It's fabulous, fabulous. Chris, what else can we say about you? Public servant at Spotsylvania, professor of writing at St. Bonaventure, a true Renaissance man, author of over 25 books. If you haven't come across one of his titles, we should have a few of them out in our book sale. And anyway, with that said, Chris, how about you join us on stage? Big hand of applause. Thanks, Tim.
Now, I never do PowerPoint, so tonight's going to be an exercise in Chris fighting with technology in front of a bunch of strangers. So I hope you enjoyed that show. It's getting close to my bedtime. It's 9:15 my time. So if I fall asleep, I apologize. It's been a long day. My family and I got up at 3 o'clock this morning to leave out of Reagan National to get here to be with you tonight. I've been super excited about coming out here. You wouldn't know it because my daughter lives in Scottsdale, New York, which is outside of Rochester. So I've been telling everybody, like, I'm going to Scottsdale, Arizona, because I just keep getting that mixed up. And they're like, where's Scottsdale? It's like, well, it's near Phoenix. You in Scottsdale? Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, that's the place. So I'm really glad to be here in person. It's been a long delayed showing. I think it was canceled once for COVID, canceled a subsequent visit. So I'm glad to finally be here. It is my first time in Arizona, and just my wife and 8-year-old son Maxwell have come with me, and it's been a wonderful trip so far. I'm with a group of historians. Collectively, we call ourselves Emerging Civil War. There are 30 of us that have different writing styles, different interests, different backgrounds, a lot of emerging voices in the field, a lot of emerging perspectives. We contribute content to a blog that's free. You can follow along every day at emergingcivilwar.com. We do have a series of books. We have a yearly symposium Mark has been to. We've been honored to have him join us there. We do have a podcast. Speaking of Kurt Fields, he and I were just recording an episode yesterday. So the first 2 episodes in April will be me talking with Kurt and Thomas Jesse, who does Robert E. Lee. And they are the Park Service's Grant and Lee. And they'll be there at Appomattox for the 160th. So our first 2 podcasts of the month, we'll be talking to them. I actually speak to them as themselves rather than as Grant and Lee, because they can say things about Grant and Lee when they're talking about them as opposed to when they're talking as them. But Kurt was really excited that he's able to come out here and talk to you guys. He mentioned that yesterday. And absolutely, he channels Grant. He's a body double for the man. So you guys are really in for a treat. He and I are working on a biography together of Grant during the Civil War that'll be out later this year. So I want to start, we're going to talk about some controversial stuff today. My goal is to help you leave here with some new things to think about, but also some tools for thinking about some controversial stuff. And I'm going to start with something super controversial. How many of you have seen Gone with the Wind? Okay, all right, very good, very good. Now, how many of you would say that it's one of the greatest movies of all time? Like as a movie, right? Okay, many of you. Okay. So in my class today, I'm teaching a Civil War class, the first time in 20 years the university's offered a Civil War class. And I made a reference to Gone with the Wind. And the students just were like, and so how many of you have seen Gone with the Wind? One kid, Oliver, in the back row, has seen Gone with the Wind. It's like, wow, okay. But I use that as an example to contextualize some of the things we'll discuss tonight. Because in this room, how many of us have seen it? We all raise our hands. And many of us, it's one of the greatest films of all time. I've got one student who's seen it. Okay. Values change over time. And what people once upon a time thought was awesome and great, people of another time have different opinions. Okay, now we could bring my students in here and we could arm wrestle over whether Gone with the Wind is something that they should watch or not. But the fact is, values have changed over time, and that's really going to inform a lot of what we'll discuss tonight. I got interested in this. You might remember in August 2017 when there was a rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and a bunch of white supremacists got together with tiki torches and they were marching on the campus. And the next day there was a counter protest. And as things really got hot and bothered and people got pepper sprayed in the face, someone drove a car through a crowd, killing someone. It really escalated into the ugliest part of America that we could probably imagine. And as a guy who teaches in a school of communication where the First Amendment is super important, we have it on the wall in our student lounge. The right for peaceable assembly is so important. And then to see that descend into violence, it's so heartbreaking to someone who really believes in the ideas of free speech. So I went down to Charlottesville a couple of days later. It's just about an hour down the road from my house. And I wanted to just kind of bear witness, I suppose. I started my career as a journalist once upon a time. I feel it's important to go down and just kind of see things for myself. And by the time I got there, they had put big black tarps over a statue of Robert E. Lee and over a statue of Stonewall Jackson. It had been at the center of some of these protests. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know any stories about Garbage Bag Jackson from the Civil War. This is next to the courthouse in Charlottesville. And as I was standing there, there was actually a police officer that he was looking at. He was just shaking his head. He was just disappointed by the whole thing. As it happens, this is my favorite of the Jackson statues. I'm a big Stonewall Jackson fanboy, unabashedly admit it. He's not someone I would want to hang out with. He was probably a really unfun guy in a lot of ways. He saw the world in black and white. And in a world where, I really appreciate how gray things are. I love the shades of gray. I love nuance. I love to really get into the nitty-gritty on things. So to see someone who saw the world in black and white, and he really did, that's one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by it. But we'll see by looking at some of these examples tonight of monuments, how a black and white view does a real disservice to how we look at history, how we remember history, how we understand history, and then how we feel about history. This is what that statue looks like. I love it. It's my favorite of the Jackson statues. He's in motion. He's riding. His hat's blown off of his head. He's sweeping around. And he was actually kind of an awkward horseman. This makes him look a little smoother than he really did. But as a work of art, it's a really beautiful statue to look at. There's a lot you can kind of appreciate by it. So when it gets covered up with a plastic bag, it's like, So why is it covered up with a plastic bag, right? Well, it's in a public space right next to the courthouse where people of all shapes and sizes and backgrounds have to come to conduct public business. And so to have one of the great heroes of the Confederacy standing there reminding you as you go to the courthouse of who this person is and what he stood for, that creates a different reaction for different people who are walking by that statue. And I, as a Stonewall Jackson fanboy, I'm not necessarily bothered by that. But if my ancestor had been enslaved and he was fighting for a government that perpetuated that idea, I might feel differently about that. I don't know because I'm not in those shoes. But what's important is recognizing that other people can feel differently than I do. And then we have to sort of walk through and navigate that area, but understanding that there's an area to walk through, I think, is really important, and that gets forgotten about a lot. The thing that we first have to remember is that history is not memory, and memory is not history. When we look at these statues, when we look at monuments, when we look at displays, we're looking at a particular way something is remembered. And that is, we do that for a lot of different reasons. We do that to be inspired. We do that to memorialize a sacrifice. We do that to mark a spot. We do that because there's some story we want to pass along. But when we create a monument, like a statue, we're creating a particular piece of history, a particular way of remembering that story. This is a statue of Robert E. Lee that's at the Antietam National Battlefield. Has anybody seen this monument in person? Okay, several of you have. It's a beautiful statue. It was erected in 2008 on private property. And the guy who erected it paid for it out of his own pocket because he felt there should be a statue of Lee at Antietam. And there is, and there he is up in this block. Looks very noble. Blue sky behind him. That's a particular way to remember Robert E. Lee. But we could erect a statue of Robert E. Lee that shows him with an angry temper. Anybody realize that Lee had a nasty temper? Yeah. And he kept it under control most of the time. And so you knew he was really mad if he showed it. Anybody ever see a statue of an angry Lee? No? We don't want to remember him that way. That's why. But that's part of who he was. Some of you might know that as he was on his way to the Gettysburg campaign, he was suffering from terrible dysentery. When he was at the North Anna River in May of 1864, he was bedridden with dysentery. I have yet to see a statue at North Anna of Lee prostrate in his cot, going, strike them a blow, strike them a blow. Right? We don't have the recumbent Lee on a cot suffering from dysentery, but that was him. That's part of his wartime experience. So we pick and choose what we want to remember and how we want to portray it. So we're not getting honest history anytime we look at any of these monuments. We're getting a particular way of remembering that history. And that distinction is super important because when we start remembering certain ways, now we're talking about emotional investment. We're getting into that inspiration, that honoring, and we get strong emotional feelings about that. But that's not the actual history. If you were to look at this monument, there's a plaque right here. Oh, I feel like I got a lightsaber. Okay, there's a plaque right here. And it says, General Lee led his troops along this road into Sharpsburg on September 15, 1862. Outmanned 2-1, he would outmaneuver the Federals on the 17th. Although hoping for a decisive victory, Lee had to settle for a military draw. Let's just parse that out. We'll look at the second part in a second. General Lee led his troops along this road into Sharpsburg, which is a true statement. But where this statue is located is nowhere near where Lee appeared. He was never at this spot. His headquarters was at the far side of Sharpsburg. There's a monument there that marks where his headquarters location is. So here we've got a monument memorializing, but the location is wrong. So from a factual point of view, we've got some issues like he did lead his troops along this road, but he wasn't at this spot. Outmanned 2-1, he would outmaneuver the Federals on the 17th. That's one way to describe the Battle of Antietam, I suppose. Outmaneuvered the Federals. I don't think that's what happened, but okay. It could be that his army got the snot beat out of it, and he beat the snot out of the Federal armies. Single bloodiest day in American history, a monumental bloodletting that has been reduced to he outmaneuvered them. We're hiding a lot in the language there, aren't we? Right? Although hoping for a decisive victory, Lee had to settle for a military draw. And the writer in me, first of all, wants to put a comma in here because there's an introductory element that needs to tell, right? Well, like a military draw, I don't think that's what happened either. Like at the next day, he was still in position, but then he gives up the field. By general definition, If you give up the field, you're the loser. Now, and there are caveats to that. There's gray area we can get into. We can have a discussion. That's a great opportunity to talk about the outcome of Antietam and what it means. But here, this is a military draw. It's a strategic defeat for Robert E. Lee. His job was to invade the North. Does he accomplish that? No. Okay. Now, Lincoln's hoping for McClellan to destroy Lee's army. And so, Lincoln's hoping for more out of the battle too. But McClellan's like, I did what I was told to do. Stop Lee and get him out of Maryland. Hooray, I win. Okay. There's an opportunity for us to, again, have a discussion about the outcome of the battle. Okay? But the way it's characterized on this monument, I don't know. Here we have the bottom. Robert E. Lee was personally against secession and slavery. True statements. But it doesn't say that he owned slaves himself and refused to free them, even though his father-in-law's will told him to. He went to court to be able to keep his slaves, but decided his duty was to fight for his home. True statement. And the universal right of every people to self-determination. The right of every people except slaves to self-determine. Like, those are big caveats, aren't they? Okay? So here we've got someone who paid, he can say what he wants. It's his money. He made this monument. He paid for it himself. He can say what he wants it to say. But now that it stands in a public spot on a piece of land that is now part of the Park Service, people go and see this, and they can come away with some incorrect conclusions. All right? But this is how this person chose to remember Lee. And we can see that it's a specific way of remembering Lee. And I'm not up here to badmouth Lee. It is not my job to praise these guys, to tear them down. It's my job to try to understand them and learn from them. Okay? This clouds my ability to do that, because it's only telling me part of the story. And if I don't know, if I'm just driving down the road and there's, oh, what's that? And I stop and I look, I don't even know that there's parts of the story being left out. I don't know what questions to ask. I'm going to give you some questions tonight. And then, so here we're cherry picking what our memories are. We have an instance here in Fredericksburg where the memories are just flat out wrong. And I'm going to put my friend George Rabel on the spot here because he wrote a fantastic book about Fredericksburg. This is a marker that's down in front of the Presbyterian Church downtown. It was put up by the UDC, and it says, General Stonewall Jackson, by General Lee's request, on this corner, planned the Battle of Fredericksburg on November 27, 1862. I'm going to ask the expert. George, did that happen? No. No, there we go. The man who wrote the book. Right? Stonewall Jackson wasn't even in Fredericksburg on the 27th of November. He had just found out 2 days before that he was going to be at Dad. He's somewhere around Orange Courthouse. And he's on his way from the valley to try to get to Fredericksburg. But when he gets there, he doesn't even get to stay in Fredericksburg. He's going to stretch his part of the army all the way down to Port Royal to try to block any potential federal moves. He's not even there. And then the Battle of Fredericksburg is not planned by Robert E. Lee at all. He has to react to what Ambrose Burnside chooses to do. And yet there is a monument downtown that says, hey, look what happened here. That church has a fake cannonball on the front of it to demonstrate some of the war stuff. So again, I'm going to ask the expert here. So George, what sort of verdict would you pass on this monument?
Highly inaccurate.
Highly inaccurate. Well, there we go. We have it from the expert. So again, like there are places where we will go and we will see information, we'll see monuments like this. And we don't even know that it's correct or not. Okay? Now, I use these as examples because one thing that happens as we talk about monuments or any controversial subject when it comes to Civil War history is there tends to be kind of this universal, oh, we can't do this, or we can't do that, or we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. But if you look case by case, we can see that there might be room for discussion. So I want us to think about this idea of history versus memory when we're talking about monuments, when we're talking about the Confederate flag, when we're talking about headstones at Arlington National Cemetery. I want us to think what's actual history and how are we remembering history? What are the facts versus what are the feelings we have about those facts? Right? Then there's that notion of accuracy. Is this accurate or not? Or is it, in the words of my friend George, highly inaccurate? Okay? Reductionism, that idea that everything fits into one easy, neat to understand box. Okay? All of this must happen. All of that is good. All of that is bad. All of this must be torn down. All of that must be preserved. Then when we reduce it to those absolutes, we lose that nuance. We lose that ability to ask what's accurate, what's not. What helps me understand what doesn't. What's the story being told? What's being left out? And then there are other contexts we also need to consider, particularly when we're talking about something like a monument. Because I told you, like that Stonewall Jackson monument, I love it as a work of art. Some of these monuments that we see are beautiful works of art. I don't know if anybody had been to Monument Avenue in Richmond before the statues came down. And that was designed as a piece of urban planning for people to be able to drive up and down that boulevard, seeing these statues, and it was basically an outdoor art park. That's a different function than memorialization necessarily. Each of those statues was a memorialization, but as a whole, that's kind of a different thing. What about these ideas of free speech? The dude paid for his own plaque. He can say what he wants, particularly since it was on his land, right? But then that notion of we're saying something. Is it accurate? Is it true? Is it bother somebody? Is it offend somebody? Are we trying to offend somebody? Are we accidentally offending somebody? So free speech issues, really important to me. They come with their own shades of gray. There's this notion of stewardship. Some of you might remember back in 2018, the National Cathedral, suddenly remembered it had a pair of beautiful stained glass windows that depicted Lee and Jackson. Has anybody seen those? I didn't put a picture here. I apologize for not doing it. They were beautiful, beautiful. They were paid for by the UDC once upon a time. The United Daughters of the Confederacy forked over money. You give this much money, we give you stained glass windows. You get to decide. Because as the National Cathedral was being built, it needed money. And so that was one way it raised money for its construction. So the UDC, once upon a time, wrote a check. They got their stained glass windows, and it is really sort of lost causey. Here's Robert E. Lee with the angel shining around, and there's Stonewall Jackson rising from the dead. It's just like really, really, lost causey. But the UDC paid for that based on an agreement with the cathedral. And then the cathedral was like, well, this is Confederate. We should probably take this down. And my thought was, but they paid for that based on your rules. There's a contract someplace. You have a responsibility to them. And if you're bothered by that, you don't want blood money, which is a thing. Are you going to write them a check? You're going to give them their money back with interest? And to me, these are questions that I think are they get forgotten about. People just have these emotional reactions. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And there are legitimate questions beneath those issues. But there's just such a knee-jerk reaction that we sort of forget about some of these questions. And then there's this notion of presentism. And that goes back to my thought that it's not my job to judge, it's my job to understand and to help other people understand. And I can't do that if I'm here in the present casting aspersions about people who lived in an entirely different time. A great book by David Lowenthal called The Past is a Foreign Country. I don't know if anybody's read it. Go read it. Okay? The past, and like if you went to China, they do things differently in China. I've been to China. They do things differently in China. I didn't show up there expecting them to do things the way I do them. I'm going into their house. I'm going to try to be a little respectful about the way they do things, right? The past is the exact same way. They did things differently. And in 150 years from now, are people going to look back at us today and be like, oh my gosh, can you believe they ate meat? Oh, those terrible cannibals. Or, oh my God, they put their old people in nursing homes. Oh my God. You know, like, there'll be plenty of things that we might do today that 150 years from now, people are going to look and scratch their heads and wonder about. We do the same thing when we look back at people 150 years ago. I don't know anybody today that's like, yeah, slavery, that's a good idea. Yeah, right? But it was legally recognized in its time. It was the source of incredible debate and discussion, both in the North and the South. The North was not a monolithic slavery bad, and the South was not a monolithic slavery good, positive good. There were factions, North and South, that fought not only with each other, but amongst themselves. How am I to possibly understand that if I'm too busy here in the present, looking down my nose at them, saying, woulda, shoulda, coulda? So those are all sorts of things we have to keep in mind when we're considering these very emotionally charged issues today. So here are some things that I like to ask when I see something come up in the news. And, you know, I was supposed to come to you guys and talk, and COVID came, and I was supposed to come, and we had to cancel. And it's funny, like these issues are still relevant today. Mark Twain said, the past doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we're hearing some of those same rhymes today. So these questions, I think, are still relevant today. Where's the monument located? If it's on public property, that's a different story than if it's in the town square or in the courthouse lawn or on a battlefield. Those are all different contexts that give those monuments different meanings depending on who finds them. If I go to a battlefield, I sort of expect to see monuments. The soldiers were trying to tell stories about what happened there. But they're also got little tricks up their sleeves too. They're going to put their monument over here because they want to show that they were at this part of the battlefield, even though they were really over here. Great monument at Spotsylvania and New Jersey guys put their monument right in the thick of the bloody angle. They were about 75 yards to the west, which was still bad fighting, but it wasn't the bloody angle. So they want to say they were there. So the veterans themselves are telling stories, assuming we're going to show up and go, oh, wow, they were in the thick of it. Okay. But where that monument is located has a different context that gives it different meaning to different groups of people. There's a great example in Franklin, Tennessee. How many of you have been to Franklin, Tennessee? They've just done a wonderful job of bringing that battlefield together. In the center of town, there's this tall obelisk that's the Confederate memorial for the town. And when the monument controversy really was at its peak, there was talk, oh, we need to take that down. There was a group of concerned citizens, historians, community leaders who said, no, we should leave that up. But let's add some signage and let's add another monument. And so on one of the corners around that monument, there's actually a statue of a United States colored troop who represents members from that county who signed up. They didn't fight at the Battle of Franklin, but they did go off to Nashville, but they were from that county. And he's standing there and his foot's up on a block, and there's a shackle that's been broken open that's at his feet, and he's looking across the square at that obelisk. And suddenly these two monuments are now in conversation with each other, and gives people a lot to think about when you go and kind of see that. So instead of like taking down a monument, we're adding to the story. Let's have more monuments and see how that conversation plays out. Okay? So the location then becomes really important. When was the monument put up? So that's a big, is it right in the immediate aftermath of the war? Is it in the 1880s as Jim Crow is getting reestablished? Is it in the 1930s when you see the rise of the re-rise of the KKK? Is it in the centennial era in the 1960s? There are different waves of monumentation that go up. And then sometimes it's just random stuff that just appears because someone liked somebody else and wanted to put up a statue, put up a monument. But that context becomes important for a number of reasons. And I think about those statues on Monument Avenue in Richmond that were put up largely in the 1880s and early 1890s by the white community members of Richmond. Who has the economic power to afford to put up a monument in the 1880s in Richmond? And is anybody like going out into the community and like asking Black people, like, hey, you want to pitch in to a statue of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson? They don't have the money to do it. They don't have the political power to say no. So they don't have a voice in that process. You go out and ask somebody in Richmond in 1885, hey, do you support a statue of Robert E. Lee? What do you think they're going to say? Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. And if they say no, they get sprung up from a tree. Okay. And it's not funny though, because they literally get sprung up from a tree. Like that is the power dynamic underlying some of these monuments. And so when we look back and like, oh, look at these statues. Well, who does get a say? Who doesn't? Okay. And so when they're put up, the 1960s, that's when most of those monuments in Gettysburg get put up for the Confederates. Because for a long time it was a Union battlefield. We won, we're going to make ourselves a battlefield. Woohoo! Okay. Dan Sickles, whole battlefield, my monument. And the Confederates were somewhere like, geez, it'd be nice for us to have some presence here. What's going on in the 1960s? Civil rights movement. So you got all these southern states that are wanting to maybe make a statement in the midst of that. But also you have the Cold War going on, where American exceptionalism and nationalism are super important for this unified sense of who we are as we're facing the commies. And so battlefields become places where we can all come together around that national identity. So you've got really complex social forces going on as these monuments are going up in the 1960s, saying a lot of different things. What's really cool though, and a lot of people don't realize you can do this, you're going to look up a lot of these dedication ceremonies. What did they say as these monuments were being erected at the various times? If you look at Jubal Early's speech when Robert E. Lee's statue gets erected on Monument Avenue, it's pretty clear that that statue of Robert E. Lee is a big middle finger to Black people based on Lee's bad old man. Okay? That creates a particular meaning in its moment that then kind of gets forgotten about. We drive by and like, look at that statue, it's awesome. It was a beautiful statue. But it was put up for a particular reason at a particular time. And we should and can investigate what that is. And then that's still, like, we don't necessarily pass judgment on what that is, but like, okay, so now that we've got this additional information, how does that help me better understand how I'm reacting to this as I see it now? Okay? It's not about judging them in their moment, but judging ourselves in our moment as we interact with these things. Who put the monument up? Makes a big difference. Is it publicly funded? Is it a private monument? Okay, so there are property issues involved. There are public property issues involved. And those can determine like how easy is it to take something down or put something back up. The statues on Monument Avenue in Richmond, most of them just came down overnight because the city owned most of them. The Lee statue was a state on a state-owned piece of parcel, a state-owned parcel that was put up by the SCV and so the UDC, and so they couldn't just take it down because they didn't have the legal authority to do that. And they finally found some way to make that happen. But like knowing who owns the work makes a difference in what you can do with the work. So here's a statue of Stonewall Jackson that's on the grounds of the Virginia Capitol. Anybody know anything about this? This statue has stayed up. This is a statue that was, it's the first statue raised to a fallen Confederate, and it was raised by British admirers who started raising money for this within weeks of Jackson's death. And within 2 years, they had pretty much had enough money to have the statue put together, but the guy who was running the effort got sick, health problems led to delay. So it's not until 1875 that this statue gets put up by British people. And it's on the state grounds of the Capitol. So, like, can we make assumptions about who put that up and why is it there? I don't think we can. But if we kind of get into the background of why it was put up and who did it, well, that might tell us a little bit more about how we can interact with that statue. Here is a dual equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson that used to be in a park right across from the Maryland Historical Society. It depicts their last meeting at Chancellorsville on the 2nd of May, 1863. And you can't really see the whole inscription, but it starts with "so great," goes all the way around, and then comes out with "purpose" on the side. It's a quote that talks from Douglas Selvall Freeman that talks about that meeting. But all you can see on the front is "purpose." So great. And the city of Baltimore took this down and put it away, kind of an overnight thing. And I looked at the statue. It's a magnificent statue. It's the first double equestrian statue ever cast. So like from an art history point of view, it's got its own little footnote. Lee and Jackson were never in Baltimore. Like, I don't know why the statue was there in the first place. It was erected in 1948, so it's not in one of these sort of waves of memorialization that happens. It's just this random cool piece of art that shows up in a place that Lee and Jackson never were. So what do we do with that? You know, it's got a piece of a position in art history. It's got, you know, just kind of some neat stuff, but it's got these components that are historically dissonant with its location. So again, having a discussion about this can maybe help us figure out what to do with it, as opposed to hooking up a chain to your pickup truck and yanking it off the pedestal, which is what happened or tried to happen with some of the statues in Richmond. Here we have Matthew Fontaine Maury, Pathfinder of the Seas. This was another statue on Monument Avenue. Next to him is Hunter Holmes McGuire, who was Stonewall Jackson's doctor. That sits on the Capitol grounds at Richmond. Here we've got two great scientists. Like McGuire goes on to help found the American Medical Association. The VA in Virginia is named after him. Maury, he's the father of oceanography. Anybody here invent a science anytime recently? And like, I was particularly disappointed when the Maury statue came out, because just in general, I don't think we do enough in America to honor our great scientists. And so, you know, here's a statue. Now, he happened to be a Confederate. He was too old to serve, but he was involved with the Confederate Navy. He comes from Fredericksburg, Virginia, my stomping ground. What do you do with statues like this that recognize these men not for Confederate service, but for other significant achievements? But they're tarred with being Confederates. And we follow that slippery slope all the way down to what do we do with George Washington? Yes, he was our first president. Yes, he won the Revolutionary War, but he owned slaves. Okay. What do you do with that question? I mean, I know what I do with that question. But for some people, the slavery issue is a disqualifier. And that gets back to that notion of reductionism. Some of you might remember when statues were coming down and coming down and coming down. There was a statue of Ulysses S. Grant that was in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Someone yanked that down. All statues are bad. Like the guy saved the country, you know. He did have a slave who he let go. You know, like there's like, just he doesn't fit in the category because everything gets reduced to all good, all bad. We end up making mistakes. We end up having difficulty navigating some of these issues. So if we take a look at specific situations, I think we can then have intelligent discussions on a case-by-case basis and avoid that temptation to reduce and to attack with presentism. Here is Gimli the dwarf on a horse from the Lord of the Rings. This is James Longstreet at Gettysburg. People have strong feelings about Gary Castile's statue, dedicated in 1998, I think it was. He's not up on a pedestal. He's down on the ground so people can interact with him. The horse is intentionally disproportionately smaller to kind of make Longstreet seem a little larger than life. He's someone you can walk up to and look at. And that was Gary's intent. It was like he wanted people to be able to interact with this. And I can't remember, I spoke to a lot of people coming in, but someone said, if we take him down off the pedestals, who said that? Okay, oh, very good, yes. So yeah, if we take him down off the pedestals, and I mean that literally as well as metaphorically, and we then start looking at them eye to eye, who are these people? What can I learn from them? What can they teach me? And approach them as human beings and approach them with humility, we can learn a lot. But if all we want to do is walk up to these guys and see them lifted up above us on the pedestal, then we lose that human element and we forget they were just like us. To me, that's what's the extraordinary part of the whole story of the Civil War, is these are people just like you and me doing extraordinary things under incredible circumstances. Well, you know, like, of course the gods can do that, but can I? These people tell us, yes, you can. But we can't treat them like the gods. One of my favorite images in the whole world, I've got it in my office. It's a picture of Robert E. Lee and Elvis Presley and Jesus Christ. And it says the Southern Trinity. And well, yes, of course, right? You know? But boy, we forget that they're human. I mean, and you know, for those of you who are Christians, you know, like Jesus came down to be a person too, right? The humanity is what's really important about all of these stories that we can learn from, that we can emulate, that we can be inspired by, that we can avoid. Okay? And so again, that walking up to the James Longstreets off their pedestals is an opportunity for us to have a conversation with these people, to learn about them and to learn about ourselves. Here's a statue that was outside the courthouse in Charlottesville, right next to the Stonewall Jackson statue. And here is just this, it's the county monument to all the guys who went off and served. And they're memorialized on the courthouse grounds. That's a much different kind of statue than raising up one of these Confederate heroes. Like, these are the guys who are just like us, who went off to do their duty as they saw it. And we're going to remember their sacrifice. We're going to remember the guys who didn't come home. Their names are often on these monuments. And we can see these sorts of monuments in public squares, north and south. If you drive through New England, you can connect the dots on your map by the little statues that all came from the same company, same statue. That's how well I can connect the dots. These soldiers. Right? That's a different context than these great war heroes. But it's also on the courthouse lawn where I have to come to do business, where I have to go cast my vote. And if I'm an African American, am I allowed to cast my vote? And there might actually be somebody with a gun out in front of the courthouse who's got something to say about me casting my vote. And so an image like this evokes different reactions from different audiences depending on its placement. So that kind of gets into some of the final questions I'm going to pass on to you. Last one I want to just kind of mention, like, who are the experts? Who can tell me about this? Who's got some expertise? Who has looked into it? Who has studied this? Expertise, and I say this as a college professor, kind of seeing it, like, expertise right now in America is under fire. People don't trust experts. We don't trust the media. We don't trust politicians. We don't trust a lot of people. Yeah, we don't trust experts. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. Unfortunately, a lot of them are political, okay? But we forget, like, they're experts for a reason. Like, you asked me to come to Scottsdale, Arizona for a reason, because I've spent some time with these things. So who are the experts? What resources can they point you to? And so if you don't trust experts, look at their footnotes. Do the research yourself. Let them point you to the work that they've done, and then go check their work. You can do that work yourself. Any good historian is going to say, here's where I got this from. Here's how I came to this conclusion. Here are the notes. Go read this transcript for yourself. Come to your own conclusions. Don't take my word for it. So if you don't trust the experts, you can do the work yourself. The experts will leave a paper trail for you. They'll leave breadcrumbs. So these questions I'm going to pass along, they come from a project that I had helped assist with George Mason University, their Dialogue and Difference project. And these are tools to deepen the discussion. And so here's some context as we talk about monuments, as we talk about Confederate flags, as we talk about Arlington National Cemetery. Pay attention to my intentions. Meaning, I might say something, and I might not be trying to make you angry. Don't get angry at me. Okay? Boy, we are living in the age of outrage. Everyone's just looking for an excuse to be offended. Get themselves upset, you know. You're a snowflake, and you're a snowflake. We're all snowflakes, and it's a great blizzard, okay? Let's put the outrage aside and pay attention to each other's intentions. Now, I might say something that I'm trying to tick you off. I might do that just because I'm being a jerk, or I might be trying to be provocative to get you to think about something. Pay attention to my intentions. Balance advocacy with inquiry. I'm a big believer in the idea that I'm trying to understand. I love it when I go out and give a tour at Spotsylvania Courthouse and someone helps me see the battlefield in a new way. And my wife owns part of the battlefield. I'm married into my own battlefield. It's awesome. She's got wonderful earthworks. I love her for more than her earthworks, but boy, she's got some good work. Right? And when I go out there with people, and if someone can help me see my own battlefield, I'm like, I love that. But I've got to be humble enough to realize that someone can teach me something in my own backyard. I want to understand. I don't want to just tell you. I want to hear what you have to say too. Today, a lot of talking, not a lot of listening, right? Build shared meaning. Confederate flag is the easiest thing we can use as an example because people who are pro-Southern heritage, they look at that and they say, like, my great-great-great-grandfather fought under this flag. He sacrificed. He did incredible things. He had to give things up. And like, I understand that because I'm proud of both of my grandfathers who served in World War II. Like, I'm proud of their service. So I can understand why someone who has an ancestor north or south is proud of their ancestor's service too. And I get it. But that flag means something different if, for instance, it was waved in your face during the Civil Rights Movement, or Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats when they co-opted that flag to use it for their own purposes. I teach in Western New York, and there are parts of rural Western New York I can drive around, and people have Confederate flags hanging off their houses. Like we fought a war about this, right? Which side won? Okay? And those flags mean different things to different people. And part of the problem is, like, we're all like, well, no, here's what it really means. Well, that's what it really means to you. But to someone else, it means something else. And that experience is just as real as yours is. Yours is real too. So let's have that conversation to figure out, well, what does it really mean? Why does it mean the things that it means to us? Use self-awareness as a resource. Yeah? I hope by the time I die, I have finally figured myself out. You know, we're all there. And if we're all serious students about the Civil War, we're all still trying to figure it out. Okay? And being conscious of our own journey as students helps us better appreciate that journey. Helps us better figure out what questions to ask. Where do I need to go? How do I need to grow? What do I still need to learn? What can I still offer to the conversation? And then explore impasses. You think this, I think that. Let's call the whole thing off. You say today and I say tomorrow, right? No. Like, let's find that common ground. Why is there an impasse? Why are you seeing it this way, but I'm seeing it that way? And just having the dialogue, having the discussion. Because if we're engaged in discussion, we're talking to someone else. It's not just some anonymous person that we could be a keyboard warrior. Dialogue means connection. And if we can see each other as human beings, willing to engage in honest discourse and disagreement, and there is the possibility of the loyal opposition, boy, oh boy, that's so much more productive and so much less stress-inducing than if we just get ticked off at each other. Here are some things for you guys to think about yourselves. When did you become interested in this? Did you just happen to see something on the news tonight and now you're all fired up? Or have you been reading about this for years? Have you gone to places and interacted with these monuments, with these symbols? Have you walked through the graves of Arlington National Cemetery? Those experiences create a type of meaning for you. Okay? What's at stake? Sometimes we get all upset about things that really don't mean a whole lot. But also, maybe they don't mean a whole lot to me, but they mean a whole lot to you. And so that gets into that impasse thing. And if we talk about that, it's sort of like, oh, okay, we can understand the stakes. And understanding the stakes allows us to then de-escalate, allows us to have discussion, see if we can come to some sort of accommodation. Have you seen these monuments in person? If so, when, where? What'd you think about? How'd you feel? I mean, most of these monuments are intended to invoke some sort of emotion in us. They are intended to make us feel. And that's why it gets so tough to have discussion, because we're like reacting with our lizard brains. You know? What do the monuments mean to the country? Think about the Lincoln Memorial. Well, most of us are like, oh, that's not controversial at all. There are some people who still will say Lincoln was a tyrant. They hate his guts. Right? But like, that is about as American a temple as we have created as a nation. What does that monument mean to the nation? And we can have that same question on a community level. What does that monument say? What does Silent Sam say about us at UNC as a community, as students? How did students understand what their responsibility was in 1861? How do students today understand what their responsibility is? What can Silent Sam teach us about those 2 points in history and how they're the same and how they're different? What are the greater implications of this conflict for our country? I would argue that our inability as a country to have an honest discussion about race has plagued us for more than 160 years. Reconstruction still is going on in some crazy, awful, terrible way. Right? And so to me, those stakes are pretty high. But that's why we study the Civil War, so that then we can maybe understand Reconstruction a little bit better, that we can understand the Civil Rights Movement a little better, that we can understand today a little bit better. Maybe the stakes there are bigger than I realized. But maybe the stakes aren't. I don't know. How do we approach contested histories? This idea that Robert E. Lee means this one thing to me, but he means something else to someone else. Abraham Lincoln means something to me, but he means something to someone else. What do we do with that? Why does it matter? What can we learn from each other by having that conversation? What's next? What are the ways we can move forward? How do you see people working together on this issue of the future? In Fredericksburg, and Linda, I'm sure you remember this, there used to be a slave auction block on the corner of William Street. And it was kept there as a monument so people could see this visceral reminder of slavery once upon a time. And when the monument issue sort of exploded, this gathered a lot of attention. And what are we going to do with the slave auction block? And so there was a big community discussion, and some people wanted to just wrap a chain around it and yank it out of the ground. Other people wanted to put a box over it, cover it up. The city council wisely had a series of public meetings, public hearings. They got experts involved. And the first thing they did is they dragged this process out. Wisely, I think, because it let tempers cool. And so instead of being all, people were like, well, no, here's what I think. And they were able to have discussions about it. And eventually, they did take it out, and it's in the city museum. There's a display about it. It talks about its history. People can still see this reminder. But it's not there front and center for every African American to drive by and think, that's what used to happen to us. But it came about through discussion, through a process where the community got to talk about it, figure out what are ways that we can move forward. What do we do with this? How can we work together? There's a problem here. How do we as a community solve it? And to me, that's the basis of all of this, is the process where there's discussion and dialogue. And we get past the lizard brains and we're able to talk about it. Because once upon a time, Gone with the Wind was one of the greatest movies ever. And today, only Oliver in the back row has seen it. Attitudes change over time. And as Thomas Jefferson said, we today, where we're at, we should not be handcuffed by the decisions of the people of the past. We should be able to be free to make our own decisions today. And so, anybody who thinks Gone with the Wind is awesome, yes. If you've never seen it, go watch it. But if you guys say, please do, yeah. But you got something else to do. That's okay too, because the world's a busy place and we all have things to do and we all have different things that drive us and we all have different passions. And that's okay. So if we recognize that values change over time, and that's okay, it's a part of life, then let's talk about that. Maybe you might discover Gone with the Wind's a pretty good movie for you to enjoy today too. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Before we do Q&A, we're going to do a little Q&A and then we're going to give them another round of applause. But each year, our roundtable presents an award to a historian that has dedicated their life to public history and service at the Civil War parks. And Chris, you're this year's recipient of the Ed Bars Award. And so we named
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. So anyway, we made a small trophy. Well, I made a small trophy for you. It sort of honors Arizona's small part in the Civil War. And
I'm going to see it tomorrow.
and so I want to let you know, there was a YouTube where you were at Ted Savis's office and you were walking around the office and he was trying to show you the coolest trophies. So I thought, I'm going to try to make Mackowski a trophy that he can put up. And when people go, hey, that's kind of a cool trophy, handmade from Arizona. But yeah, we very much appreciate you coming out. This is our little way of saying thanks. I'll set that down because we're going to have you answer questions. I'm going to go around. Audience, anybody have a question? I know we're short on time, but we're going to try to get to a few of them before we get kicked out. We have one over here.
Could you go back to, now 3 slides, to the dialogue and discussion?
Sure.
That was a great, for all kinds of things.
Okay, here we go. And so John does have a copy of this PowerPoint. If you're interested in having a copy, just reach out to him, and then it's okay, John, if you want to share that with folks. If you want to have these things.
Absolutely. Do we have questions? We have one in the back.
I'm not sure I need the microphone. I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between the density of monuments and lynching.
The density of monuments and lynching. Wow.
There's a lot of literature on it.
I haven't explored the correlation. One, and I'm off the cuff here. One could, in a very macabre way, sort of look at lynchings as a sort of. They're definitely a public statement. I don't want to go so far as to say they're a kind of monument, but they are a public statement saying, here is a certain code that we're enforcing. We want to send a message, and we're going to put it out there in public for folks to look at. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Jackson, Mississippi. They've got a civil rights museum there that is hands down one of the most incredible museums in the world. It reminds me very much, give me the same sort of reaction I had when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's like I punch it in the gut sort of thing. And there's a whole exhibit hall about lynchings that are there. And then just recently I had the chance to visit Montgomery, Alabama, where they have the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is essentially a national lynching memorial. And they have these giant rectangles, cast iron rectangles, from each county a lynching ever took place in America. And they have the names of anybody who's ever been identified as a lynching victim inscribed on those. And you walk through, and it's a giant rectangle. You walk through, and at first they're on the ground, and then they kind of rise up, and then they're hanging around you, and you walk through them, and then they're hanging above you, and you're walking underneath them. And then you go out the back, and you see duplicates all laid out on the ground, and you realize these rectangles are shaped like coffins. And so then everything that you've just walked through is now laid out in front of you. And I don't know if this answers your question, but lynchings are one of those really understudied components in American history that were basically the dark side of monuments, where it was the enforcement of this social code in a really dark way. Monuments are this enforcement of the social code saying, like, look, here are our heroes. Here are the people we should emulate. Here is the awesomeness. We're going to enforce the social code this way as well. So there's this really weird juxtaposition, and I'm just riffing here. So I don't know if I can like dive into those numbers, but you've just raised something to me that's like a fascinating juxtaposition.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, all right. Brad, I'm walking away from you. Brad wants to take you down off your pedestal. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't.
I just wanted to ask, as I was looking at the picture you had of the church in Fredericksburg, and I'm starting to wonder for some of the monuments about the influence of money. Because I may not know about Fredericksburg, but if I'm there as a tourist who doesn't know the whole story of the battle, and I see a sign that says, Stonewall Jackson, who I do know, and Robert E. Lee, who I do know, they met here. I'm likely to go in, and if I go in, I might actually buy something because I believe. And I'm wondering if that's part of some of the reasoning why, monuments are worded some of the ways that they are. What your thoughts are on that?
That gets back to that old joke about like George Washington slept here, so why gotta go sleep there too, right? So as a tourism hub, sure, there are financial considerations to some of these things, but I think part of it is just for a lot of monuments, the people who are creating them didn't want to let facts get in the way of a good story, and so like we're going to tell you the story because this is how we want the real story to be told. And they're going to find ways to literally chisel it into stone. And then they are going to put it like in a place where like, oh yeah, okay, no, I don't know any better. This is great. I'm going to go in and check out the church. Sure, that happens all the time.
We got a question from Bill.
Yeah, I just have a question. In your experience and research, are some of these monuments that were hastily torn down back in the Charlottesville period, are they starting to find new homes that are appropriate to be displayed?
Some of them are. Richmond still has all of its statues kind of hidden in a public works warehouse. They did not release the location because they don't want people going in and vandalizing them. There's still a question of like, well, what are we going to do with these? There have been private individuals who've like, I'll pay you $20,000 and you let me put that monument up on my yard, and is that inappropriate? So a lot of entities are still trying to figure out what to do with some of their monuments. I'd heard that the Charlottesville ones were destined to be melted down, and I can't remember, they had some sort of commemorative use that they were going to do with them. Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had a long checkered history of where his grave has been in Memphis. He's finally been reburied in Columbia, Tennessee, at the headquarters of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. They've taken the monument that was in downtown Memphis, they put it on top of his grave that's on their ground now. He has nothing to do with that property, nothing to do with the SCVs. Like, we want to be caretakers of those remains. A.P. Hill, who was buried under his monument in Richmond, they disinterred him, moved him to the family plot in Culpeper. We got a state police escort and everything. So it's a case-by-case sort of thing, and there are still places trying to figure that out.
Okay, one more question. We got Paul.
Chris, do you think the lack of history over the past 25, 35 years have not been taught in our schools contributed to the activists that did tear the monuments down and destroyed a lot of them?
That's kind of a tough question. I've got mixed feelings about that because, I think we all hear like, oh, they just don't teach history anymore. How many of you have heard that? They just don't teach history anymore. But every summer I go to work for the American Battlefield Trust at their Teacher Institute, and I work with teachers who are in the classrooms doing this stuff, and they're looking to do the best they can. Many of them have limited resources. History's not getting any shorter, so they've got more and more stuff they've got to teach every year. State standards change. But I think there are a lot of teachers out there trying to do their best under challenging circumstances. I also saw a presentation at one of those conferences where a guy, I can't remember his name, but he actually had data to back this up. And apparently, this will be a surprise, for the last 75 years, people have been saying they just don't teach history anymore. And in fact, it's the way we remember how history was taught has changed over time. So they're still teaching history. They've got a lot better methods for doing it. But it's just that there's an ongoing perception that they don't teach it well, when in fact, they've been teaching it pretty well based on the data for about 75 years over this longitudinal study. So, and I don't know that it answers your question, and I'm not trying to excuse or justify anything, but I think that there is a difference between what is taught, what's not taught, what students are learning, which is different than what's being taught, and kind of what they're taking away.
All right, everybody, one last round of applause for the great Chris Mackowski.
Thanks so much. I'm super humbled by that.
Very good.
If you got a box for it.
Chris, you taking a shot at it. I wanted to ask you.